It's a pet peeve of mine for people to throw the word self-care out there, and maybe it is for you too. They say, "Oh, I'm working on self-care." It sounds like they're saying, "I'm going to go do some retail therapy," or, "I'm going to go get my nails done." And look, there's nothing wrong with those things. Those things are great, but psychological progression, I think, is rarely about pampering yourself. Time travel with me back to the year 2006. I'm in Stafford, Texas. I'm inside of a gym called Powerhouse Fitness. Used to be a grocery store. They converted it into just a typical commercial gym. I told myself that if I could just get in good shape, I would feel good about myself. If I could just get a six-pack, I wouldn't feel so anxious all the time. If my skin was tight on my arms, maybe I would talk nicer to myself. Now, at that point, I had the workout. I had the tight skin. I had the attributes, yet I didn't feel any better. Now, on the surface, as we could say it typically looks in most gyms, if you appear physically healthy, there's an assumption that maybe things on the inside are good, but the truth is that you have to directly work on those things instead of hoping for some contact high, instead of some secondhand smoke effect. You know what I mean by that? So just like we know that physical health is a result of progressive overload, I now believe that you have to directly work on tangible aspects of your psychological health in the same way. Mental wellness is a byproduct of conditioning. Mental wellness is a byproduct of progressive overload through self-examination, we could say. It's a pet peeve of mine for people to throw the word self-care out there, and maybe it is for you too. They say, "Oh, I'm working on self-care." It sounds like they're saying, "I'm going to go do some retail therapy," or, "I'm going to go get my nails done." And look, there's nothing wrong with those things. Those things are great, but psychological progression, I think, is rarely about pampering yourself. It's about figuring yourself out. So does getting your nails help you figure yourself out? I don't know, maybe, but I imagine that figuring yourself out is a little harder. Figuring yourself out, I think, is not easy, but it's also not impossible to understand or know what you should be doing. Now, shortly after the Powerhouse incident, and it was a real moment where I looked in the sea of mirrors and I realized I was in good shape and I wasn't necessarily happy. Shortly after that, I went to grad school in neuroscience. I've been studying this for the last 20 years. That's how long it's been. And still, I wouldn't claim to know everything. I don't want to sit here like I have everything figured out, but I do know enough to be helpful. And that's what this video is about, is to try to break something down that seems very vague, very nebulous, and to create, even if we're reducing it down a little bit, some framework that would be helpful. And you might say, well, helpful for what? I believe that you could get someone in great physical shape. And yes, there's research to support that physical health is absolutely correlated to better mental health, but one doesn't demand the other. Being in great physical shape does not demand that mentally everything is where it should be. And so you have to work on it directly. If you're a coach, you should, I believe, in this day and age, have a framework and be well versed in how to ask questions around this particular topic, just like you would around mobility protocols or sleep hygiene. I think of psychological health as this Venn diagram that has three circles that absolutely overlap in lots of ways. You would want to triangulate your self-examination in not just one area, but across these three. And we could agree that they work in concert with each other. Those three I call emotional regulation, mindset, and self-awareness. And because different people have different definitions of these words, let's go over them briefly. And then my hope is that you, the listener, would have a way to evaluate and assess where you're at. And then even though we're not talking personally, I would give you an atypical example of how, if you found something that you did want to work on, well, you would know how you might go about that. Shall we begin? Number one is emotional regulation. Emotional regulation, I think, is a superpower. Now, emotional regulation doesn't mean that you're this stoic samurai that doesn't feel anything. On the contrary, it means that you're very attuned to any type of change in your physiology. The precursor to emotion is the fact that there's a change in rate of speech. There could be a change in core body temperature. There could be a change in body language. There could be a change in the level of energy and even pleasantness. And so we can take something that feels very touchy-feely, and as athletes, as people that are more focused on physical health, we can turn this into something that is very physically driven. To be emotionally regulated means that you, number one, can sense those changes. Two, you have a very robust vocabulary to describe what you think is going on. And ultimately, you know what to do with yourself or in communication with others to channel those emotions in a healthy way. Now, if you and I wanted to play a game where you came to me with any preventable health problem, I'm pretty sure that I could map it back to emotional regulation or the lack thereof. So I think this is incredibly important, and there's no other way to address it except just head on. Now, secondly, mindset. Mindset is a combination of words, sentences, stories that we say about ourselves to ourselves. The verbal working memory system in the prefrontal cortex is more active than any other muscle in our body. It is constantly trying to make sense of what's happening in real time, and then almost as like an after action report of things that have already happened to you. This is a part of the autonomic nervous system. That means you're not thinking about this. It's just happening. It's happening without you giving it any input. Now, while psychotherapy is not what we're talking about here, it is helpful to think about most of the issues that we deal with are unformulated experiences. So this part of our brain is going for it, but we're not giving it any input to actually direct the story and the words into something that would be useful for us. So it's basically like we've let this part of our brain run around like a feral honey badger left unattended, versus putting it into our consciousness and having some awareness, those are really popular words, to know what it is that we're trying to interpret for this thing that's just happened to us. Lastly, self-awareness has a few different definitions depending on what psychologist you ask, but to me, in the context of what we're talking about, it just means meaning. Being self-aware means that you have a meaning and an understanding of why it is that you're doing something. So much so that you're not as concerned about what people think about why you're doing something. Think about that just for a sec. Multi-dimensional health is disruptive. Doing one thing like everybody else is doing, not that radical. But across the board, for you to claim that you're going to make decisions that will be in your best interest means that at some point, you're going to make a decision that is not in the best interest of someone else. To do that, you have to have a deep, deep meaning behind it. If you're not as dialed as to why you're doing something and why it would be okay to look like a kook at times, then I don't like your chances of being able to actually do that long term. So those are the three areas, and just a quick definition so we're on the same page. As a coach, I think it's really helpful for us to make sense of this area of our health like that. Now, for anyone that we work with, we don't demand that we go spelunking into the deep recesses of their brain, because lots of people, especially when they just start, aren't ready to talk about that. But there's nothing wrong with asking questions. And for lots of people, that's as far as we go. We're just bringing some attention to these things that maybe they've never even been asked in their entire life. Now, for these questions, there are three simple ones that we ask at the very beginning of a relationship with our clients. We have what's called an assessment, which isn't anything new or novel. What may be novel is the fact that we're addressing several different areas of health within this assessment, one of which is what we're talking about today. And so those three questions is just one for each of these little pillars. The question for emotional regulation goes like this. Hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you're animal from the Muppets and 10 being you're the Dalai Lama, how would you rate yourself on handling big emotions? They give us a score, and we go from there. For mindset, the question we ask is this. How well do you speak to yourself? One being the voice in your head as the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, and 10 being the voice as a totally compassionate and understanding being. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. The last question around self-awareness goes like this. What are the reasons why you are really here? What are some of the big important things in your life driving you to be your best? What are some of those things that are important to you? I'd love to hear some of them now. Now, in those first two questions, it is the subjective 1 to 10 Likert scale. This last one, we're seeing how many reasons they can come up with. We've done this enough that we can start to make some initial judgments, so to say, some initial inclinations about where in each of these they might rate low. Now, whatever comes up, we just make some notes of it. When we're finished with the entire assessment, we circle back to anything that stuck out as potentially a bottleneck, potentially something that would limit the rate of progress across other areas. And we decide as a client and a coach together if this is where we want to focus, because you can't do everything at once. So with that as an understanding of what these are, how we might assess where we are with these things, let's switch gears and let's say that you're the client. What would that process look like for you? Let's say that you determined that for emotional regulation, you don't think that you can really always control the things that you're feeling. Well, one of the first things we might do is just pay attention to a change in state. Just like building an aerobic engine, first, we might not start by increasing the intensity or even doing something, but just like a scientist, notice what's going on. Every time there's a change in breathing pattern, speech, heart rate, energy, level of pleasantness, do you notice? Next, do you notice it in other people and their body language? That right there might be a several-week experiment by just cataloging and recording things that they notice. Now from there, we might start to more accurately try to label what it is that they're feeling. Now why? Well, anger when used in the proper context means that you have unjustly been acted upon. We could define it that way. That eventually has a different regulation and response than if what you're really feeling is disappointed, which is to say that something didn't happen that you would hope for. So feeling something, understanding how that feeling equates to emotion, and then understanding the different responses could be a several week, several month process. And again, this is an atypical approach, but I hope you get the gist that there is a process and a progression that you can break down in reasonable amounts of volume and intensity. Now for mindset, let's say this is where you feel like your bottleneck is. This is your limiting factor. You don't always talk kindly to yourself. Nothing's good enough in your mind, and therefore you're not good enough. I want you to know that I can relate deeply if this is you. Now, an atypical approach is first we could trap that on paper, like a field research assistant. Every time that thought pops into our head, we're just writing it down. What we say to ourselves doesn't change the facts of the story, but it does change what we want to remember. We can look at those words you're saying in your head and edit them like a shrewd English teacher. She would say something like, "Are those really the facts, Peter?" She would say, "I always fail. Is that really true? Do you always fail? Is that the best sentence? Or should it be, I haven't succeeded yet?" A lot of times this process is just taking things that are, let's be honest, really dramatic, statements that sound like always, never, and we just make it something that's a little bit more realistic. From there, and again, we're generalizing, we can apply these rules of conditioning to rewrite with greater volume and intensity. These mistakes that our brain makes are there in order to protect us. But what we found is that often we don't need protecting. What we need is an accurate set of facts to help us make sense of things that have happened to us. Here, bringing in a third party like a trusted coach can help us realize how inaccurate the language is that we use in our heads. Lastly is self-awareness. Let's say you have no idea why you are doing what you are doing. It's actually pretty common. We know this stuff is good for us, but besides not being ashamed or guilty, we don't have a compelling reason why it makes a lot of difference. I'll give you a big cheat code for all this, and this is a small tangent. Anybody's answer that they come up with ultimately is to try to reduce the suffering of others or themselves. You being healthy makes you more useful to yourself and more useful to others. Being less healthy in the long term produces more. Now, I'm not saying that we can avoid tough times, but I am saying that this prompt can be helpful. This is the whole reason why we've gravitated towards visualization exercises to look back at once had passion for, maybe even aptitude for, what was embedded in that DNA of those experiences. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we were world class when I use the word aptitude. It just means that without anyone's encouragement, we liked to do it. Believe it or not, there's some through line into why those activities were inherently enjoyable for us and why we could somehow rewrite the narrative of why it is that we want to be healthy today. At the same time, we as a staff spend a lot of times visualizing what the distant future may look like. We've done exercises like write your own eulogy, take a time machine to what the ideal version of you at 60 looks like, and so on and so forth, as a way to extrapolate how meaning and what that would look like long term can give us some justification to make the decisions that we want to make today. And there you have it. Like physical training, we won't split hairs on what the best workout is or what the perfect workout combination might be. We're just happy that you're working out. Same thing here. This isn't a black or white type scenario, but are you on the same path for your mental conditioning that you are for your physical? What hard work are you doing on the inside to match the work on the outside? Now, for more personalization, because we can only go so far in a video like this, I hope that you'll reach out for an assessment. You don't have to live in Dallas, and you don't have to become a member to go through this robust assessment that we've concocted, not just through psychological health, but across 6 different territories that we think make up this super healthy person. If you're a coach, we hope that you'll join us in our online community. The link can be found in the description below, where we're constantly talking about this stuff and refining what it means to be a health coach in this day and age. This has been a monumental statement about incremental change brought to you by the good people at BPR.